Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another Sit Down with Skriv. Today, going to be joined by MiGHTYMAX. Looking forward to this one. We've got a fair bit to talk about, I suppose. There's obviously been some recent news around the Endpoint side of things, but we'll kick off with a simple. How are you doing? How are you feeling?
Yeah, it's good. It's nice to be here. I think it's the first time here, so yeah, it's good to give away some of our secrets, I suppose.
Yeah, a little bit, right? We'll definitely get into that. I think I just sort of wanted to kick off with the general idea of it, really, because you're a team that have moved around players quite a lot. Been sort of a bit of a farm in a way, right? You've got so many names now that have moved through the endpoint doors and all that sort of talent scouting and everything. Seems to be super effective. So I just kind of wanted to start there before we talked about actual moves themselves. I just wanted to talk about like the methodology of how that happens. Do you take part in that when it comes to bringing in new players? Is that something you do?
I think it depended basically on our staff at the time, right? I think there's a different approach, obviously, with Regin than there was to Ross when we had Ross. I think it's important that everyone's involved. Like, obviously, I'm involved, right? I have to look at the player and see how they perform in other games and stuff like that. But um, the process, it can differentiate, but often it's like, this player seems pretty good, so we're just going to get him, right? But sometimes we look further into it. Like an example I've always given was Flames, right? When he was relatively unknown, we looked into his demos and actually watched games that he was playing rather than just looking at the stats, right? So that was like a more in-depth version of our process, if you want to call it that. Whereas, when it came to like Kirby, for example, it was just more like, okay, he's a good player, we already know that. So it kind of, there's similarities and differences, but generally we find a player, we see whether we think he's good enough, and then we'll bring him onto the team.
Yeah, is it difficult to kind of stay motivated around that? Because I know that there's been quite a lot of times where you guys have like made a pro league, for example, is usually what happens, and then you get sort of gutted afterwards. That one individual that looks really good gets picked up. Do you find it difficult as a player to stay motivated, or is it just something that's part and parcel of where Endpoint are at as an org and a team?
I think it's tricky. I like to think that it obviously, like, it's natural to be, you lose a good player and you're back to rebuilding, right? But it's like it's more so you find like a sense of like team pride, I guess, in the sense that we're able to continuously build these players up and get to a point where we're happy. And then it's just like if we had a bit more time or different circumstances, they still be in the team and we're doing better, right? Or before we have to rebuild. So like I think there is an element of both, like for me it's like proven track record of getting these players good, getting the team good, and then obviously if they get bought, they get bought. That is what it is. It's just business at the end of the day. But there's also, it is when it happened the first couple of times, it was like, okay, here we go again. But I think the more it happened, the more it was like, okay, now we know how to speed up the process a bit more, like more efficiently, and how to do things better. So it's like, for me, it's just part of the job now, I guess.
So how does that affect like your IGL role then? Because obviously you're bringing in these new members. Do you play a pretty rigid style, or do you have like a much more versatile kind of style to facilitate as many players as possible? What sort of style do you think works with this revolving door that Endpoint seems to have?
I think you have to have an element of both. I think it's important that you, you have to know why you're picking these players up is the most important thing. Like, what role are they going to play in the team? Because let's say, for example, you have three passive players and you get a fourth passive player, then who's going to be making these risks in the round, right? To be a playmaker, like no one's going to be doing it. So in that sense, there is we do think logically in that sense. When we picked up Nurse, for example, we knew he's going to be an aggressive player, right? So we knew put him in these roles, he will succeed. Let's support him the best we can. Whereas let's say when we got Mezzi, for example, we didn't really know like what sort of player he was. We knew he was good, and I think typically if you look at it, he's more of like a supportive player. But we were like, I believed he was good enough to play these star roles, right? I was like, we're making room for this guy, and let's set him up. And he obviously performed insane, right? So it's an element of both. Like you don't want to change too much, but also you want to do enough to support these players and put them in roles that they're going to be good at doing, right? And if they're not comfortable with it, you try and help them become comfortable with doing it.
Yeah, so let's kind of move on to a little bit of the more recent stuff then, because obviously you have Nertz removed from the team. Is this a big one? Is this maybe one of the bigger pickups, bigger removals? Because Nertz was really looking good, and I think that when Valde got dropped from Ents, everyone was like, "Get Nertz! It's got to be Nertz." Nobody else is going to be able to fill that same sort of role. So how does this one feel losing Nertz as compared to some of the other players?
In terms of the impact to the team, I think it's roughly the same because when you look at it, we had Thomas who went to Envy, we had Flames who went to OG, right, and we had Mezzi that went to Fnatic, obviously, and now we have Nerds that have gone to Ents, right. So like they all played similar roles in the team, and it's like the impact they have in the team is obviously quite big, right? We set them up to have all these star roles. They get all the frags, right? Like it's obvious that they're performing well if these teams want them. So it wasn't like a shock to us that this happened. We knew this was going to happen at some point because of our experiences in previous teams, right? We knew that obviously if you have a player that's performing 1.1, 1.2 rated, these big teams are going to come looking for him, right? Like, and everyone knows an Endpoint English speaking team. Obviously, you have to speak English, so these international teams can come in and be like, "Oh, he looks good, let's get him," right? So, in terms of the impact of the team, I think it's been roughly the same in comparison to other players, right? But it's just, I think the more it's happened, the more I'm confident in how we can rebuild, right? So that's the thing that I see.
Yeah, and I think what we will do for the sake of the viewers, then obviously I'll make sure that this gets released after everything all comes out. I've also got Pete coming on for an interview at some point, so I can maybe run it by him, so to speak. But have you guys been rolling through trialing new players? Have you figured someone out yet, or are you still working through that process?
Yeah, so like if you release now after it gets announced, and I can say that obviously we've been playing with Fessor, right? Like he was playing with us with the RMR qualifiers,
Mm.
and we were really happy with him, right? So we're just going to continue playing with him. Another young talent, right? He was obviously an Astralis talent, that Monty team. So yeah, we was happy to pick him up and move forward.
Okay, cool. So, I mean, that kind of sheds a little bit of light. You say he's quite a young player. You obviously had Boris come in a little bit ago. We're kind of, going through the whole Rolodex of Endpoint sort of stars, as it were. How did you feel about, bringing in more young talent? Is it something that you're trying to cultivate and hopefully, you can get these players stuck in the team for a little while longer and build a roster around them? Or do you find that it's a bit easier to work with someone that's got more experience?
I mean, I think our philosophy has always been to find these younger players, right, that have unknown skill ceilings or that are unheard of, right, at the time. That's always just been like the Endpoint way, I think, and I think it's like there's obviously pros and cons to it. Obviously, the pros is that you can kind of mold them into a player, right? Whereas if you get a more experienced player, they've maybe already been molded by someone else, or they have certain beliefs of the game, right? So in that aspect, it could be nicer for me and for the coach and for the other people on the team that you get a younger player that you can just say, okay, this is how we're going to play, this is what role you're going to do, and they don't, like, it sounds weird, but they don't know anything else, right? That they believe that that's what they should do, right? So I think that's how we've always done it, and I think that's what we will continue to do, because it makes the most sense for us, I think.
Okay, fair enough. I mean, it didn't go so well with Boris. What was kind of the stuff there? I know that location was maybe a little bit of an issue, and he was quite young as well. Is that something that affected the sort of Boros removal eventually?
Yeah, so we picked him up, and I think, if memory serves me, he was like 17 at the time, and he had just, I think when we made the RMR, he had just turned 18. But yeah, it was just differences in play style and beliefs and stuff, which can happen, right? Like if he doesn't want to be in the team, doesn't want to be in the team. But yeah, like obviously he's really nice to work with, insanely skilled, right? Obviously that goes, like, I think everyone knows now who Boros is, right? So yeah, it was just like a difference of seeing the game and stuff. Yeah.
And what about Crucial? I feel like Crucial's a pretty big one, right? Obviously, being in the team for a long, long time. I'd kind of said as well, it felt like he was maybe the move for a little while, but you guys stuck by him, and I don't know whether you decided to try and give him more resources or whatever. He's always a very good sort of like turret AWPer, as it were, but maybe not quite as explosive as you need from an AWPer. Was that a hard move to make, do you reckon?
Yeah, for me it was extremely hard, right? Like obviously it wasn't just my call, but it was like at the time we were in this weird period where we just picked up Kirby, we did kind of well, and then at the time the team got told that there was a possibility of getting MH out, right? And he was a hot form AWPer, right? So it was like, do we do it or do we not? And for me, it was a really tough decision. Like ultimately, like I didn't want to do it, but like at the same time, it was like everyone in the team saw the opportunity here, right? So it was like, and everyone knows that in Endpoint, it was always me, Surreal, and Crucial, right? So it was a really, really tough period.
Yeah, definitely. I think, unfortunately, sometimes those moves just have to happen, a fresh start type thing. And he seems to have found his feet a little bit on different teams. So, still all credit to him. How do you think the team looks at the minute then? So you've obviously got the 5-man roster sorted and solidified. Um, is this a better looking team, you reckon? Is this a work in progress kind of team at the moment? You're obviously back in Challenger League and stuff like that, so you've got a lot of games to be playing at the moment. How do you feel that the current Endpoint is feeling?
Yeah, obviously it's a work in progress, right? You can't say too much or too little so early on in the team, but I think every evolution of the rosters, there's always something different. There's always, experiences that you can learn from previous rosters and processes, right? So I think um obviously we're confident in the team, right? Obviously we wouldn't be playing. That's stupid to say. But like it's just too early to say. I think we've only been practicing for less than a week, right? So yeah, that it's too early to say.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, I mean it's still relatively early on, but that's a good general overview of where the team is at the moment and how you kind of deal with the moves and whatnot. I wanted to get some of your views on where the tier 2 circuit is at the moment. You guys have benefited quite well from the whole path to pro, couple pro league appearances. You've obviously been part of pretty much all of those, if not all of them, to be fair, over the past sort of year and a half, 2 years that you've had a few stints in pro league. Obviously the Na'Vi win last time out, which was pretty nice for all of us involved. Is there a sort of enough of a crossover involved between the higher and the lower levels? Do you find it sort of like overwhelming when you get to a pro league and you've got all these pro teams, the high level that play against each other all the time and they're just so mixed in, and then you come along and it's like you don't have enough time to adjust to the new LAN environment and all that kind of stuff? Do you think that the tier 2 circuit is effective at the moment?
I think like the CS has never been as competitive as it is now. Regardless of what tier you're at, all the time you see upsets, right? I don't. The only like if I had an issue, it would be the blast format. I think the ESL one is, it's acceptable, right? You have these different avenues into Pro League, and you will obviously have teams that will find a big jump in the skill gap between where they're from and the Navis, the G2s, right? And I think that's obviously going to be natural. But I think every time we played it, there's always been a really great experience, right? Whereas the Blast one seemed a little bit more tedious. You have to go through so many loopholes to make it to these events that are practically partner only. It's like you have these partner teams, and you have these teams that you have to go through open qualifiers or qualifiers to qualifiers to qualifiers to single elimination, right? So it's a very tedious process. That's the only complaint I have. But in terms of tier 2, it's like I don't think it's been better, to be honest. I think that you have a lot of tournaments almost at a weekly schedule. Swiss formats. You got your like ESL Prems, your national championships, right? That have this path, and um, I think it's a really healthy scene right now, and obviously it's really competitive because there's no in tier 2 like anyone beats anyone, right? And you have some teams that will even elevate themselves and upset these tier 1 teams.
Do you find it's a bit difficult to focus, on all these different tournaments? It sort of blurs into one. Can the burnout be a
Yes.
problem with it?
Yeah, I mean, just from my point of view, like it's similar almost to the COVID. When COVID first hit, you had all these tournaments then transition to online instantly, and you had week after week after week, and they all had the same format, the same Swiss format, and you don't know what specific tournament you're playing, right? So you finish a game and you're going to tweet, "Oh, I've just won or lost a game here," and you might even tweet the wrong name of the tournament, right? Because it's like it just feels like the same tournament. But yeah, in terms of like prize money and playing, like I think it's really great for the tier 2 scene.
Yeah, it is. It is definitely good to see. I think that there's so many different tournaments to get involved in. Do you maybe like prioritize other ones? This is always something that we have as like a bit of a line as commentators, that it's like, oh, you have like ECL is really important, so kind of have the A game that comes to that, but maybe a CCT qualifying stage that you have to go through is a little difficult. Is there sort of some days where you're more motivated for a particular tournament or not?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we weigh up the pros and cons, right? Because if you had six of the same tournament and then two of them gave you added bonuses, like maybe some more ESL ranking points or maybe a more like a qualifier invite to some other tournament, then obviously you're going to prioritize those, right? So we don't just accept every single one and just play every single one. We do try and alleviate our schedule a little bit and try and prioritize the ones that we want to do better in, so that we reap more rewards, right? Whether it's more ESL world rank points, whether it's maybe a higher prize money or something, I think that's suitable to do.
So let's move on a little bit more of the current state of the team. We sort of alluded a little bit that you currently have the addition of Fessor sort of coming in. I guess my first question on that would be, why did you go with Fessor? What is it about him that obviously you've played a few games first of all, which definitely helps. But what is him about him that's so much better than the rest of the field that you could have had?
I'll be honest with this one, it was a little different than the more traditional um, endpoint approach, where we actually look into players and we'll see how they're playing and whatnot. But it was the way it happened basically was that when we figured out that Nerds was going to be going to end, it was like, who do we get for the qualifiers, right? And we had no idea. And then it was Regin that recommended Fessor because he's Danish, right? And obviously he knows him from the Danish scene. So we said, yeah, there's nothing to lose, right? We'll just play with him and see how it is. But when we played in the RMR games, it was actually, that's when I realized that he could be a suitable replacement, right? Like that in that when we were playing with him rather than watching him play, it was when I realized that he fits this role and he could be a suitable replacement. So that's how it all came about, really.
Yeah, and how did those RMR qualities feel? Because obviously you guys didn't make it through, which is a little bit of a surprise. Do you think that is just down to the fact that you didn't really have enough time to get the reps in? The Nerds move was poor timing for you, you reckon?
Yeah, I don't know if I can reveal the actual timing of when it happened, but it was pretty poor timing, obviously, because our goal that we set was, obviously to make the RMR. And when you lose a player like that, who's obviously such an impactful player, you have to almost, as a caller, you have to adapt to that scenario and try and play in a way that is not reliant upon knowing strats and like grenades and stuff, right? So it's tricky in that sense, because obviously you want to make the RMR, but then obviously every other team there wants to make the RMR, right? They're not here just to muck about in the qualifiers, so it's a really weird situation. But obviously, like, we're not going to harp on the fact that we didn't make it, because our circumstances were different than if it was a full team and we'd been practicing the entire time, right?
Yeah, it just feels like definitely unlucky, I think, is what everyone's kind of been saying as well. That's the way that it looked outside in, and that kind of stuff just happens, unfortunately. It feels like maybe this team is a little bit more of like a complete package type team that you're going for, right? Where you have a few more names that are able to do the heavy lifting rather than just sort of relying on one. Would you say that that is accurate this time around?
I don't know whether that's ever been the case, but I think what I've learned more recently is, we have to try and, definitely, you can't rely on one person, right? Like, whether it's, people used to say that, Zywoo with Vitality, or you had Simple with Navi, and they just rely on one person. I don't think that's the case anymore. I think you have to try and build systems where everyone's contributing in different ways, right? And I think that's really important in today's CS, because if you look at all the top teams, they have unique systems and ways of playing. And I think that is the key part of it. Whether people believe that we did that or not, that's what we're trying to implement right now. Is to make it so everyone is contributing equally.
Okay, fair enough. And where do you see this, to give it 6 months, right? And obviously at the moment you're sat at like 33rd in the world. I think they might have changed this week or whatever, but ultimately you're in a pretty good spot at the minute. Where do you kind of see this team going? You think that it can push you further than where you're at the moment, or do you have a bit more work to be done at this sort of level before you can start popping off, right? Because as we've said, you've got a lot of young players coming into this team, and Heavy God, for example, that we've not really mentioned, didn't have much official experience, as it were, before coming into the team.
I think in when you at this sort of stage, you're not a tier 1 roster making these changes. I think you always have to reprove yourself in this tier 2 sort of scenario. Like we have to be going to, obviously in 6 months' time, we'd like to be in a situation where we are winning these CCT tournaments, right, or these Elises or whatever it is. But the process to that point is critically important, right? Whether you're doing the right things, whether we're making the right decisions for games and whatnot, and scheduling and all that sort of thing. So obviously we want to. I'm not going to sit here and say, nah, in 6 months we're going to be no good, right? But we have to also prove ourselves in this tier 2 setting before we can say, okay, now we're good enough for tier 1, right?
Yeah, how does that come about, I suppose? What is it that you feel is it able, because we have a lot of these teams that float around, and maybe they make like top 25 would be, but how do you get past that and get past that consistently? What is it you think that makes the sort of let's say B tier teams stick around that level, and then the teams that are able, like Entropic did it a little while ago, right? Maybe Ecstatic, you could say, as well, did it a little bit ago. How do you get to that extra level that is just above like the top 30?
It's hard to. I mean, I guess the one thing would be consistency, because the team for me right now would be Team Spirit. They're the most recent example of a team that they don't have these franchise spots, but they are consistently raising eyebrows. Like, oh, they just beat this team. Oh, they've done a deep run here. I think it's all about solidifying your play style and everyone being comfortable with it, and also an element of like individual consistency, right? 'Cause you're not going to win games if people aren't killing or whatever. But it's really weird because like obviously I was playing like back in COVID when it was Gambit youngsters, and then they all of a sudden within kind of it felt like no time at all, they've gone from this sort of rank 60th team to top 20, and they were like winning tier 1 events. Right, I was like, oh my god, like that rise was insane. But it's hard to know what the recipe for success is if you haven't got it yourself, right? Because obviously I'm not. We haven't been in Gambit, we haven't been in Spirit, all these other teams. So I think it is consistency, but also developing a play style that is unique and comfortable for everyone on the team.
Is there like an added layer of difficulty as well? Because you have to delve into players that are English speaking and things like this. You're not able to bring in, like, a lot of the CIS talent generally tends to play with each other. I'm sure you would have loved to kind of snatch up maybe some of the ex-Entropic players when that sort of came through. So do you have this extra layer of difficulty with you being an English speaking team?
There's definitely difficulty in the different. Yeah, like not everyone's a native English speaker. For us, that's a difficulty because you do sometimes find that um, there are differences in communication, right? You might say, like, I might say something and someone else interprets it as something different in a game, or they have to translate what they want to say in their head before they say it, right? So then sometimes that gets sort of a bit weird in games. So that there is that element that I think works as like a disadvantage for us. But like at the same time, everyone that we bring in, obviously, we help improve their English, right? It's not like we don't help them at all, and it's just like we just have what I call like CS English, where just cool stuff in game. Like we do also talk outside the game and stuff. So I think it's different for 5 Danish people, or 5 Russians, 5 Ukrainians, whatever it is, right? I think it's more natural in this communication, which is also, I think, really important to become a consistent team.
Okay, cool. I think that will indeed do us. We've had a nice little round there of how Endpoint are looking, and indeed what to expect from the future. Your thoughts on the tier 2 scene as well, which has been good. So thank you very much for coming on, Max, and yeah, cheers for your time.
Thank you.